I need you to understand something before I tell you any of this. My father was not a paranoid man. He didn't stockpile ammunition in the basement or fill notebooks with conspiracy theories. He was a high school shop teacher who drove a 12-year-old Subaru and coached JV baseball in the spring. The most dangerous thing in our garage was a table saw with a dull blade he kept meaning to replace. So when he woke the house at 4:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, whispering for us to pack one bag each and nothing more, the ground under everything I knew shifted by a quarter inch. That was all it took. My mother, Karen, was already dressed. That's the detail I couldn't shake loose for weeks afterward. Not in pajamas, not fumbling for her glasses on the nightstand. Dressed. Jeans, boots, her brown canvas jacket. Which meant she'd been awake. Which meant they'd been talking. Which meant whatever was happening had a head start on me and my younger brother, Eli. Eli was 14. I was 19, back home for fall break from a state college 2 hours north where I was supposedly studying mechanical engineering, but mostly studying how to exist without a schedule. I'd gotten in late the night before, maybe 1 in the morning, after a drive through rain that had turned the freeway into a long black mirror. The house had been dark. I'd eaten leftover pasta standing over the kitchen sink and gone to bed without brushing my teeth. Normal. Everything still normal. "Just clothes and your phone charger," Dad said from the hallway. His name was Glenn. I'm going to use his name because he deserves it. Glenn Maddox, 46 years old, standing in the hallway in the half-dark, with car keys already in his hand. "We're leaving in 10 minutes. "Leaving for where?" I asked. "Your uncle's." Uncle Pete lived in Harlan, a nothing town 90 minutes northwest, up past the reservoir, where the foothills started folding into real mountains. He had land, a few acres with a pole barn and a well house and a vegetable garden my aunt had maintained before she passed. I hadn't been there in 2 years. The idea of driving there before dawn on a weekday made no sense until it made too much sense. And the territory between those two feelings was a place I didn't want to stand. "Why?" Eli said. He'd appeared in his doorway, wearing basketball shorts and a t-shirt from a camp he'd attended in 6th grade. His hair was flat on one side. He looked exactly his age, and something about that made the moment worse. Mom answered before Dad could. "There's been an escalation. The towns east of the river are under evacuation advisory. Your father and I decided last night we're not waiting for it to become mandatory." She said it the way she said everything, measured, direct, like she was delivering test results she'd already reviewed. Karen Maddox was a labor and delivery nurse. She'd spent 20 years walking into rooms where people were terrified and making them believe things would be manageable. She was doing it now. I could see the technique. That didn't make it less effective. I'd seen the news, of course. Everyone had. The feeds had been full of it for 3 weeks. The infection reports out of the southeast, the emergency declarations in Georgia and the Carolinas, the footage that looked fake until you watched it long enough to notice the details that no one would fabricate. The way the afflicted moved. Not fast, not cinematic, not like anything from a movie. Wrong, mechanically wrong, like the body was being operated by something that understood locomotion in theory but had no respect for joints. I'd watched a clip on my phone in a lecture hall, surrounded by 200 other students, and the room had been silent, in a way that lecture halls are not supposed to be silent. But it was far away. That's what we kept telling ourselves. 6 states away, then 4, then 2. And each time the distance shrank, the sentence restructured itself. It's still far enough away. The word "still" doing all the heavy lifting. I packed in 4 minutes. Jeans, thermals, a hoodie, socks, my phone charger, a pocket knife I'd bought at a gas station 3 months earlier because it was on sale. I didn't bring a single book, a single photograph, a single thing that mattered to me emotionally. I have thought about that more often than I should. We gathered in the kitchen. Dad had a cooler on the counter, already loaded water bottles, protein bars, sandwich bags of trail mix. Mom had the first aid kit from the upstairs bathroom and a second one I didn't recognize. Bigger, with a red cross printed on canvas that looked professional grade. Eli held his backpack against his chest with both arms like someone might take it. "Phone's on silent," Dad said. "We go straight to the car, we pull out, we take Route 11 north. No stops unless I say." "Glenn," Mom said. Just his name. A complete sentence between them that I couldn't translate. He looked at her. "I know." Then he walked to the garage door, put his hand on the knob, and opened it. The overhead light in the garage was off. It was the first thing I noticed. Dad always left it on a timer that kept it lit until midnight. But either the timer had failed or someone had turned it off manually. The only light came from the utility LED strip along the workbench. A cold, blue-white line that turned the Subaru into a shape and the rest of the garage into suggestions. Dad hit the wall switch. The fluorescence buzzed once and caught, filling the space with that flat institutional brightness that makes everything look like evidence. The garage door was still down. The car sat where it always sat, slightly left of center because Dad parked around the lawnmower. And standing on the other side of the car, between the Subaru and the closed garage door, were 3 people. 2 men and a woman. They were not infected. I knew that immediately, and I want to be clear about it, because in the weeks that followed, I met people who told stories about mistaking the healthy for the sick and the sick for the healthy. And both versions ended in ways that don't leave you. These 3 were alive in the right way. Dirty, breathing hard, eyes too wide, but present. Human. The woman was closest. She was maybe 30, dark hair pulled back with a rubber band, wearing a rain jacket over what looked like hospital scrubs. She had both hands raised, palms out, and she spoke first. "We're not sick, please. We've been walking since midnight." Dad had his arm out, pushing me and Eli behind him in a gesture so instinctive it looked involuntary. Mom stepped sideways, not behind him but beside him, and slightly forward. I watched her eyes move across the 3 of them with a diagnostic efficiency I recognized from hospital visits, checking skin, checking pupils, checking the way they held their weight. "How did you get in here?" Dad asked. His voice was steady, but it was his coaching voice, the one that carried across a diamond. Authority without aggression. He was managing the situation the only way he knew how. The taller of the 2 men answered. He was black, maybe mid-40s, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled. His hands weren't raised, but they were visible, held at his sides with the fingers spread. "Side door," he said. "It wasn't locked. We tried 3 houses. 2 had people inside who told us to leave. Yours was the only one with a door we could get through without breaking anything. We didn't touch your car. We didn't take anything. We just needed to be inside walls," the woman said. "Even for a few hours. There are people on Elm, on the road. They're not..." She stopped. I watched her assemble the next word and fail. "Not people anymore," the second man finished. He was younger, early 20s, white, with a shaved head and a split lip that had bled recently. He was holding a tire iron against his leg, not threateningly, just holding it the way you hold something you've been carrying for so long, your hand has forgotten it's there. Mom moved first. She took 2 steps forward, around the front of the car, and stopped at a distance that was close enough to communicate trust, but far enough to react. She looked at the woman. "What's your name?" "Dana. Dana Reeves." "I'm Karen. The scrubs are you medical?" "Phlebotomist at St. Francis. I was leaving night shift when the parking structure—" Dana's voice fractured. She sealed it back. "I couldn't get to my car. I just walked." Mom looked at the older man. "Clarence," he said, "I don't have a medical reason for being here. I was at the gas station on 5th when the sirens started. My truck's still sitting at pump 3. The younger man with the tire iron said his name was Joel. He didn't offer more than that, and nobody pushed. Dad hadn't lowered his arm. I could feel Eli breathing behind me, quick and shallow, and I reached back and put my hand on his shoulder without looking. A gesture I'd borrowed from Dad without realizing it. "Glenn," Mom said, turning halfway. That single-name sentence again, but this time I could read part of it. "We can't leave them here." "We're going north," Dad said. Not to Mom, to the 3 of them. "Right now, I have room for 2 more in the back if you don't mind tight." "3 people, 2 seats," Joel said. Not arguing, counting. "Eli rides in the cargo area," I said. It came out before I thought about it. "He's small enough. I'll sit in the middle back." Eli opened his mouth to protest, saw my face, and closed it. Clarence shook his head slowly. "You don't know us." "No," Dad said. "But I know what's on Elm Street, or I know enough. And I'm not leaving 3 people in my garage to find out what comes after. Get in the car. We sort the rest out on the road." Mom was already opening the rear hatch, rearranging the cooler and bags to make space for Eli to sit cross-legged on a folded moving blanket. Dana climbed into the back seat first, then me, then Joel with his tire iron between his knees. Clarence took the front passenger seat after Dad nodded toward it. Dad hit the garage door opener. The mechanism groaned. The door lifted in sections, each one revealing a new strip of the pre-dawn dark outside. The street was empty. The streetlights were on. A neighbor's sprinkler was running, ticking against the sidewalk in a rhythm that sounded like a clock that didn't know it was supposed to stop. Dad reversed out, shifted into drive, and turned north. In the mirror, I watched the garage door close behind us, and I remember thinking that the light inside was still on, and it would stay on until the timer killed it or the power did, and that nobody would be there to see the difference. Route 11 was a 2-lane state road that ran north through farmland, and small commercial clusters, a tractor supply, a veterinary clinic, a gas station with a hand-painted sign advertising live bait. I'd driven it 100 times. In daylight, it was boring. In the dark, with the headlights cutting a narrow corridor through fog that had settled into the low ground, it felt like a passage into something that hadn't decided what it was yet. Dad drove at exactly the speed limit. I understood why. A ticket, a stop, any interaction with authority right now was a variable we couldn't afford. The radio was off. Nobody had turned it on, and nobody asked. The silence inside the car was the kind that has weight, not hostile, not awkward, but loaded. 6 people and a 14-year-old packed into a vehicle that was engineered for 5, each carrying a version of the last 12 hours that they hadn't been asked to share yet. Dana broke it first. "How far is where you're going?" "About 90 minutes in normal conditions," Mom said from the front. "And in these conditions?" Clarence asked. Nobody answered that. We'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when we passed the first sign that the advisory wasn't theoretical. A minivan sat on the shoulder with both rear doors open, the interior light still on. No one was near it. A child's car seat was visible in the back, empty, still buckled. I felt Dana tense beside me. Joel's hand moved to his tire iron. A mile later, 2 more cars, both in the ditch on the opposite side, one with its hood crumpled against a drainage culvert. Then a pickup truck sideways across the oncoming lane. Driver's door open, engine still running. I could see the exhaust in the headlights. Dad steered around it without comment. His knuckles were pale on the wheel. "Something happened on this road recently," Clarence said. He said it like a man reading weather patterns, observational, controlled. "Within the last few hours," Mom agreed. "Should we turn around?" Eli asked from the cargo area. His voice was muffled by the bags around him. "No," Dad said. "There's nothing behind us to turn around to." He was right, and we all knew it. But hearing it said out loud compressed the air in the car by a few degrees. Joel shifted in his seat. I could feel the handle of the tire iron against my thigh through the fabric of his jacket. At mile marker 31, Dad braked. Not hard, not sudden, but with enough intent that every person in the car went still. Ahead, maybe 200 yards, something was in the road. The fog made it indistinct a shape, maybe 2 shapes, moving laterally across the pavement at a pace that was wrong. Not walking, not running. That middle thing, that broken gate I'd seen on screens but never reconciled with the dimensions of real space. "Those aren't people," Joel said quietly. "They were," Donna said. Dad turned the headlights off. We sat in the dark, engine idling, and watched the shapes cross the road from left to right and disappear into the tree line on the east side. The fog swallowed them. The road ahead was empty again, or looked empty, which is not the same thing. "How many did you see?" Dad asked. 2, Clarence said. "I saw 3, Mom said. One was smaller, behind the other 2. A child." She didn't say it. She didn't need to. Dad turned the headlights back on and accelerated slowly, passing through the space where they'd crossed. I looked out the window into the trees, but saw nothing. The absence was worse than presence would have been, because absence has no edges. It just continues. We drove the next 40 minutes without speaking. The fog thinned as we climbed in elevation, the road tilting upward through switchbacks that Dad took with the practiced ease of someone who'd driven them in every season. I watched the sky in the east begin to separate from the land, a thin gray line that widened into something that wasn't quite dawn, but was the memory of dawn, the sky rehearsing. Eli had fallen asleep. I could hear him breathing in the cargo area, slow and even, and I envied him with an intensity that surprised me. Not the sleep, the ability to surrender awareness. At 19, I was old enough to understand that the world had changed, but young enough to believe I should be able to do something about it. And that middle ground was a kind of paralysis. Dana was watching the road ahead with an expression I would later learn to recognize in survivors, a particular stillness of the face that isn't calm, but is the refusal to let the face do what the mind is doing. She caught me looking and didn't smile, didn't look away, just held my gaze for a moment, then turned back to the windshield. We passed a sign that said, "Harlan 22 miles," and Dad exhaled for what felt like the first time since the garage. "Almost there," he said. Mom reached across the console and put her hand on his forearm. He covered it with his own for exactly 2 seconds, then put both hands back on the wheel. 22 miles. In a different world, that was nothing. In this one, it was a promise that hadn't been tested yet. And I was learning quickly that untested promises were the most dangerous kind. Uncle Pete was standing on his porch with a shotgun and a coffee mug when we pulled up the gravel drive. He was 52, Glenn's older brother, built like a shorter, thicker version of my father, with a beard that had gone white in patches that made him look like he'd been standing in a snowstorm. He watched the Subaru approach with the expression of a man who had been expecting something and was now confirming it. The property was what I remembered. A 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a pole barn about 80 yards east, a well house with a hand pump and an electric backup, and a vegetable garden enclosed by deer fencing. What I didn't remember were the modifications. The ground floor windows had been fitted with exterior plywood shutters that could be swung closed and bolted. The driveway entrance had a cattle gate that Pete must have installed recently because the welds were still bright. And along the southern perimeter, someone had driven a line of steel T-posts and strung 3 rows of barbed wire between them. Not enough to stop a determined person, but enough to slow one down and make noise doing it. Pete had been preparing. Not in the frantic, last-minute way. In the way of a man who had watched the news and done math and not liked the answer. We piled out of the car. Pete set down the coffee mug on the porch rail and came down the steps. He hugged Dad with one arm, the shotgun in the other, and it was the most Uncle Pete gesture possible. 3 extra, Pete said, looking past us at Dana, Clarence, and Joel. 3 extra, Dad confirmed. Pete studied them, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular assessment of a man who was calculating resource allocation in real time of beds, water, food, defensibility per person. I watched him do the math and arrive at an answer. Come inside. I've got soup on the stove and information you need to hear. The kitchen was warm. Pete lived alone since Aunt Maureen's cancer had taken her 3 years prior, and the house had the character of a space maintained by a single practical man, clean but not decorated, organized but not styled. A wood stove in the corner radiated heat. The table was large enough for 8, which was convenient because there were now 8 of us. Pete served soup lentil from a pot that had clearly been simmering for hours and laid it out while we ate. The infection crossed the river yesterday afternoon, he said. Not the official line. Official line is that containment is holding. But I've got a ham radio in the barn, and the people on the frequencies are telling a different story. Millbrook is dark. Completely. No power, no cell signal, no emergency response. Warren County declared martial law at 11 last night and then stopped broadcasting at midnight. The National Guard unit that was supposed to establish a perimeter at the Route 9 bridge didn't arrive. Nobody knows if they were diverted or if they couldn't get through. He let that sit. How far is Millbrook? Joel asked. 40 miles south. We just drove from 40 miles south, I said. We saw them, on Route 11, at least 2, maybe 3, crossing the road. Pete nodded as if this confirmed something he'd feared. Then they're spreading faster than the radio chatter suggested, which means our window for being ahead of this is narrower than I thought. Window for what? Dana asked. For being ready when it arrives here. He unfolded a hand-drawn map on the table, the property, the surrounding roads, the nearest neighbors. He'd marked distances, sight lines, water sources, and what he called approach vectors, which was a military term for a man who'd never served but had clearly been reading. We have well water, propane for cooking, the wood stove for heat, and a root cellar with enough canned food for 4 people for maybe 6 weeks. With 8, that's closer to 3. I've got the shotgun, a hunting rifle, a .22 for small game, and a crossbow that Maureen used to use for target shooting. I know plumbing and electrical, Clarence offered. 30 years in commercial construction. I can handle medical, Dana said, within reason. Joel said nothing. He still had the tire iron. Pete looked at each of them, then at Dad, then at Mom, then at me. All right, here's what I need everyone to understand. This property is defensible if we make it defensible. It's sustainable if we're disciplined. And it's a death trap if we're stupid. We work together, we communicate, and nobody goes anywhere alone. Those are the rules. Anyone who can't live with them is free to leave. But the gate locks behind you. Nobody left. After soup, Pete assigned spaces. Mom and Dad got the guest room. Eli got a cot in the upstairs study. I was on the couch in the living room. Clarence and Joel would sleep in the pole barn, where Pete had set up a pair of military surplus cots and a kerosene heater. Dana took the small room off the kitchen that had been Maureen's sewing room, still smelling faintly of fabric and lemon oil. I helped Eli carry his bag upstairs. He was quiet, which for Eli was unusual. At 14, he operated at a constant verbal frequency observations, jokes, questions, complaints that could be exhausting but was also the sound of his particular aliveness. The silence worried me. "You okay?" I asked. "Define okay," he said. "Fair point?" He sat on the cot and looked out the window at the tree line. "Are we going to die here?" "No," I said. It came out faster and more certain than anything I actually felt. And Eli knew it, because he looked at me with an expression that was too old for his face and said, "You don't know that." "No, I don't. But Dad and Pete have a plan, and we have walls, and we have people. That counts for something." He nodded, not because he believed me, but because he was choosing to let me believe I'd helped. I went back downstairs and found Joel standing on the porch, looking south. The tire iron was leaning against the railing beside him. He was smoking a cigarette I hadn't seen him produce. "Where'd you come from?" I asked. Not interrogating, trying. "Millbrook," he said, "originally." The town Pete had said was dark, completely. "You walked 40 miles?" "I ran the first 10. He took a drag. "You stop running when there's nothing behind you anymore. Or when you think there's nothing behind you. And then? And then you keep walking, because stopping feels like giving up." He flicked ash over the railing and looked at me directly for the first time since the garage. His eyes were older than his face. I'd later learn Joel was 23, only 4 years ahead of me. But the distance between us felt geological. "Your dad's a good man," he said. "Opening that garage door, letting strangers in. Most people wouldn't. Most people haven't been tested yet." He almost smiled. "Yeah, that's the thing about most people." The first full day at Pete's was consumed by labor. There's a particular mercy in physical work during crisis. It occupies the hands and enough of the mind that the rest of it can't spiral freely. Pete ran the operation with the quiet authority of a man who had spent years managing his own land and now simply expanded the scope. Dad and Clarence reinforced the perimeter fence, replacing barbed wire in 2 sections, where the tension had slackened, and adding a run of chicken wire at the base to reduce the gap. Pete had a pile of scrap lumber in the barn, and Clarence looked at it the way a composer looks at an instrument, seeing not what it was, but what it could become. By mid-afternoon, he'd framed out reinforced window shutters for the 2 ground-floor windows Pete hadn't gotten to, complete with interior crossbars that could be dropped into brackets. "These won't stop someone determined," Clarence said, testing the fit. "But they'll slow them down and give you 3 seconds of warning. 3 seconds is a lifetime, if you're ready." Joel and I were assigned to inventory. The root cellar was accessed through a hatch in the kitchen floor, a steep wooden staircase descending into a cool, earth-smelling space lined with shelves. Pete's canning operation was methodical. Rows of mason jars, tomatoes, green beans, pickled beets, applesauce, chicken stock. bags of dried beans and rice, boxes of pasta, a 5-gallon bucket of flour sealed with a gamma lid. I counted everything and wrote it on a yellow legal pad, while Joel called out quantities from the shelves. We worked in a rhythm that didn't require conversation, which suited Joel. He communicated inefficiencies pointed instead of speaking, handed things directly rather than setting them down. But in the close space of the cellar, with a single bulb overhead and the cool air pressing in, something loosened. "I was in a group," he said. "In Millbrook, when it started." I kept writing. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is not look at them. 7 of us, holed up in the community center on Broad Street. Solid building, brick, only 2 entrances. We had water from the fountains, vending machine food, and a maintenance closet full of cleaning supplies that we thought mattered more than they did. What happened? Night 3. One of us had been bitten and didn't say anything. A woman named Priya. She was a school counselor, nicest person in the room. She hid it under a scarf, and by the time we realized, she was already turning. In a locked building, with 6 other people. He handed me a jar of applesauce, and his hand was steady. 3 of us got out, then 2, then 1. You. Me. I wrote applesauce times 14 on the legal pad and didn't say I was sorry, because I'd already learned that sorry is a word people say to close a door, and Joel needed the door to stay open a little longer. Dana spent the day with Mom, organizing medical supplies and walking the property to identify plants she recognized. She knew more than her title suggested. Later she'd tell me she'd started nursing school before financial constraints redirected her to phlebotomy, and she'd kept studying on her own. She had a practical intelligence that manifested as preparation. She boiled strips of cotton into clean bandages, mixed a dilute bleach solution for disinfecting surfaces, and identified a patch of yarrow growing wild near the tree line that she said had basic antiseptic properties. "If anyone gets hurt, I can handle lacerations, sprains, basic infection management," she told Pete during dinner. "But I need you to understand my limits. I can't do surgery. I can't treat a serious internal injury. And if someone gets bitten..." She paused. "I don't know what I can do about that. Nobody does." "Then we don't get bitten," Pete said, as if it were that simple. Eli helped where he could. He carried water, stacked wood, held boards while Clarence nailed. But I caught him standing at the edge of the garden more than once, staring south, his phone in his hand, even though the signal had died sometime during the drive. He was waiting for something to reconnect. A text, a notification, a ping from the world he'd been living in 48 hours ago, where his biggest concern was a history test and a girl named Sophie, who sat 2 rows ahead of him in English class. I walked over and stood beside him. "The signal might come back," he said. "It might. But probably not." "Probably not." He put the phone in his pocket. "I didn't say goodbye to anyone. Not my friends, not anyone. We just left." "I know." "Did you?" I thought about it. My roommate, Theo, had been asleep when I'd left campus 2 days earlier. My last text to him was about a dining hall menu. I hadn't called. I hadn't thought to. "No," I said. Eli nodded. We stood there together, watching the tree line do nothing, and then nothing was the point. That night, Pete called a meeting around the kitchen table. He'd been on the ham radio all afternoon, and the news was a landscape of gaps. Regional stations had gone silent one by one, east to west, like lights on a string being switched off. The military was active but fractured, as some units holding, others falling back, others simply not responding. The word quarantine had been replaced on the surviving broadcasts by the word containment. which Pete said was significant. Quarantine means you're keeping something in. Containment means you've already failed at quarantine and you're trying to control the damage. "So, what's our play?" Dad asked. "We dig in, we fortify, we ration, we maintain watch rotation. 2 people awake at all times, 4-hour shifts covering north and south approaches. We conserve ammunition for actual threats. And we wait." "For what?" I asked. Pete looked at me with an honesty I wasn't ready for. "For this to burn through or for someone to stop it? One or the other. Those are the only ways this ends." "And if neither happens?" "Then we adapt. That's what people do." He assigned watch shifts. Dad and Clarence took midnight to 4. Joel and I had 4 to 8. Mom and Dana covered 8 to noon. Pete and Eli handled noon to 4, and then the cycle repeated. The schedule was generous. With Pete, he'd given himself the easiest shift, paired with the youngest. I understood the math. Eli needed to feel useful, and Pete needed to manage his energy. He was the strategist, and strategists needed sleep. I went to bed on the couch at 10, set my mental alarm, and lay there listening to the house settle around me. The wood stove ticked. Somewhere above me, Eli's cot creaked as he turned. Outside, the wind moved through trees that didn't know the world had changed. And I envied them for the same reason I'd envied Eli's sleep in the car, the luxury of not understanding. 12 days in, and we'd built something that almost resembled a system, not normalcy. I don't think any of us were delusional enough to use that word, but structure. Structure was the scaffolding you erected inside the wreckage, so you had something to lean against when gravity shifted. The perimeter fence was complete. Clarence had extended it along the north side using salvaged fencing from a neighboring property that Pete confirmed had been abandoned. We'd checked carefully in daylight and found the house empty with the back door swinging. No signs of violence, just absence. Whoever had lived there had left, and they'd left in a way that suggested they thought they'd be coming back, because the cat's water bowl was full and a load of laundry was still in the dryer. We took the fencing. Clarence also took a toolbox, a coil of copper wire, and a battery-powered lantern. We left the cat food on the porch in case the cat came back. Watch shifts had developed their own character. Dad and Clarence spent theirs in a kind of deliberate conversation. 2 men in their 40s finding common ground the way men of that generation often did, through the exchange of competencies. Clarence talked about building codes and load-bearing walls. Dad talked about metallurgy and the tensile strength of different wood joints. They were teaching each other, and the teaching was a way of insisting that knowledge still mattered, that the future was a place where someone might need to know how to frame a wall correctly. My shifts with Joel were quieter. He wasn't unfriendly, but he'd learned to conserve words the way you conserve ammunition. Use them when they'll count. Keep them holstered otherwise. We sat on the porch in the cold pre-dawn, watching the fog collect in the low pasture south of the house, and traded observations only when something required it. A deer at the tree line, an owl. The absence of sound from the direction of the county road. It was on our shift, day 12, just after 5 in the morning, that the first one came to the fence. I saw it before Joel did, which surprised me, because Joel's awareness of his surroundings operated at a frequency I associated with prey animals, constant, panoramic, tuned to motion. But I was looking south, and the figure emerged from the fog in the pasture with a slowness that almost disguised it as natural. A shape, vertical, moving with that wrong gait. The one that looks like walking until you study the knees and realize they're bending in rhythms that no healthy nervous system would produce. "Joel," He followed my eyes. His hand went to the tire iron, which he still carried everywhere, a talisman or a weapon or both. The figure reached the fence line and stopped, not because it recognized the fence as a barrier, because the barbed wire had caught its clothing, a flannel shirt red and black, the kind you'd buy at any rural supply store, and the forward motion had been interrupted by resistance it couldn't problem solve. It pressed against the wire, and the wire pressed back, and the two forces reached equilibrium. The figure stood there, leaning, its face angled toward the house. I could see it clearly enough in the growing light. A man, maybe 50, heavy-set, with a beard. His skin had the color of something left in water too long. His eyes were open, but they didn't move, didn't track, didn't scan. They were aimed in our direction the way a satellite dish is aimed at a signal. Oriented, not observing. "Should we wake Pete?" I whispered. "Not yet. One is manageable. I want to see if there are more." We waited. The fog shifted and reorganized. No other shapes emerged. The man at the fence continued his pointless pressure against the wire, a motion that was almost mechanical, like a wind-up toy walking into a wall. "He's alone," Joel said after 10 minutes. "For now." "Yeah, for now." We told Pete it's shift change. He walked out with the hunting rifle, looked through the scope, and came back with a face that had rearranged itself around a new calculation. "He's wearing a Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department t-shirt under that flannel," Pete said. "Which means he walked at least 40 miles. Which means they don't stop, they don't rest, they don't decide it's too far." "We knew that," Dad said. "We knew it in theory. Now it's standing at our fence." The group assembled in the kitchen. The question was mechanical. What to do about the figure at the fence? The answer split along a line I hadn't anticipated. "We put it down," Joel said. "One shot from distance, clean." "With a rifle shot that echoes for miles," Dana countered. "If sound draws them." "We don't know that sound draws them. We don't know that it doesn't." "I can do it with a crossbow," Pete said. "Quiet, effective at that range." "He was a person," Eli said from the corner. Everyone turned. He was standing by the wood stove, holding a mug of water he'd forgotten he was holding. "That's a person." The silence that followed was the sound of 7 adults realizing that the 14-year-old in the room was the only one who had said the thing that all of them were stepping around. "He was a person," Mom said gently. "He's not anymore, honey." "How do we know? How do we actually know? Maybe they can get better. Maybe there's a cure coming, and we just have to..." "Eli." Dad's voice was soft, but final. Eli looked at his mug, then at me. I had nothing to offer him. No argument, no comfort, no wisdom. I was 19 years old, and I didn't know if the thing at the fence could be cured, or if it had once coached Little League, or if it had a family somewhere waiting. I knew it was pressing against our wire with a persistence that didn't care about pain, and I knew that the fence wouldn't hold forever. Pete went out with the crossbow at noon when the light was best. He was back in 4 minutes. He didn't talk about it, and neither did anyone else. But Joel and Clarence went out afterward with shovels. And when they came back an hour later, there was a mound of fresh earth 30 yards past the fence line. Eli didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. Day 18 was the supply run. We'd been rationing carefully, but 8 people consumed mathematics that didn't bend. Pete's 6-week estimate for 4 had become 3 weeks for 8. And we were approaching the edge of that margin. The dried beans were half gone. The rice was lower than the marks Pete had drawn on the bucket. We needed more, and the only place to get more was out there. The nearest town with a commercial district was Ridgemont, 12 miles west. Pete and Dad had debated the route for 2 days, examining the hand-drawn map, discussing approach angles and fallback points with a seriousness that would have seemed absurd 3 weeks earlier and now seemed inadequate. The plan: 2 vehicles, the Subaru and Pete's truck, 3 people per vehicle, in and out in under 2 hours. Team 1, Dad, Clarence, and Joel in the truck. Team 2, Pete, me, and Dana in the Subaru. Mom stayed with Eli. This was the first argument I witnessed between my parents. It happened in the guest room with the door closed, but the walls in Pete's house were not thick, and I was in the hallway. Mom wanted to go. She argued that her medical training was more relevant in the field than at the house. Dad argued that Eli needed a parent present. Mom said Eli needed both parents alive and that the team going out needed someone who could assess injuries in real time. Dad said the team wasn't planning to engage, and injuries weren't expected. Mom said the word planned hadn't applied to anything in 3 weeks. It ended with Mom staying, but the air between them afterward was compressed in a way I hadn't seen before. Not anger, something worse. The recognition that they were making decisions about each other's survival, and there was no framework for that, no precedent, no chapter in any marriage book about how to negotiate who drives into the unknown. We left at first light. The drive to Ridgemont took 30 minutes at cautious speed. The road was clear, hauntingly so. No abandoned vehicles, no signs of passage. Just asphalt and trees and a sky that was the color of old dishwater. Ridgemont was small. A main street with a hardware store, a grocery, a pharmacy, a post office, and a diner called Maggie's that had a hand-painted sign in the window reading, "Closed until further notice." The optimism of that sign, until further notice, as if notice would come. As if the situation had a customer service department, was the saddest thing I'd seen since leaving home. We parked behind the grocery, out of sight line from the main road. Pete had the shotgun. I had the .22. Dana carried a backpack and a list she'd written in handwriting so precise it looked typed. The grocery's front door was locked, but the rear service entrance had been forced open by someone before us. The interior was dim, powered by emergency lighting that was already fading to an amber glow. The shelves were partially stripped. Someone had been through methodically, taking canned goods and bottled water, leaving behind things that suggested their priorities. The organic aisle was nearly untouched. The fresh produce section was a nightmare of decomposition, and the pharmacy counter had been completely emptied. "Medical supplies are gone," Dana said, her jaw tight. "All of it. We get what we came for, and we go," Pete said. "Food, water, batteries, anything useful. 5 minutes per aisle. Stay inside of each other." I moved through the store with the .22 against my shoulder, feeling absurd and terrified in equal measure. 19 years old, holding a rifle in a grocery store, stepping over a puddle of something that had leaked from the deli counter and spread across the linoleum in a dark stain that I chose not to investigate. I loaded canned goods into a cart: beans, corn, tuna, soup, tomato sauce. Pete grabbed rice, flour, salt, sugar, cooking oil. Dana found a section of first aid supplies that had been overlooked: bandages, antiseptic wipes, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, 2 tubes of antibiotic ointment. We were in the store for 11 minutes. It felt like an hour. Dad's team hit the hardware store. They came back with duct tape, tarps, nails, a hand crank radio that actually worked, a box of Strike Anywhere matches, and a 50-foot coil of rope. Clarence had also found a battery-powered motion sensor light, the kind you'd put on a back porch, and his eyes had the gleam of a man who was already designing its second purpose. We loaded both vehicles. The street was still empty. The silence was comprehensive. No birds, no wind, no distant engine sound. Just the particular quiet of a place where people had been and weren't anymore. "Let's move," Pete said. We were 2 blocks from the edge of town when Dad's truck braked ahead of us. Pete stopped. Through the windshield, I saw what they saw. A group, maybe 15, maybe 20, moving along the cross street ahead in a loose cluster, heading east to west. Not organized. Not a herd in any intentional sense, just bodies moving in roughly the same direction. Drawn by something, a sound, a signal, a pull we couldn't perceive with that terrible wrong walk. That shared damage to the basic human motion of putting one foot in front of the other. "Don't move," Pete murmured. "Engine off." He killed the ignition. The car ticked. Dana, in the back seat, had gone completely still, her hand on the door handle, not to open it, but to anchor herself. The group passed across the intersection ahead of us like a current in a river. They didn't turn. They didn't look. They moved with the indifference of weather, and we sat in our metal boxes and watched them, and felt the exact weight of our irrelevance to whatever drove them. They were gone in 2 minutes. Pete waited another 5 before restarting the engine. Nobody spoke until we were back on the county road, accelerating, the town shrinking in the mirrors. "That was the most people I've seen since this started," Dana said. Her voice was clinical, but her hands were shaking. "That wasn't people." Joel's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie from the truck ahead. "That was a migration." After Ridgemont, the compound changed. Not physically, the fences were the same, the house was the same. The watch schedule continued its rotation, but the psychological architecture shifted. We'd seen the scale, 15-20 in a single group, moving with a coherence that wasn't coordination, but wasn't randomness either. It changed the math. It changed what the fence meant. It changed how we slept. Clarence built the alarm system the day after we returned, using the motion sensor from the hardware store, a car battery from Pete's barn, and the copper wire from the neighbor's house. He rigged a tripwire perimeter that would trigger a battery-powered siren if anything heavier than a raccoon crossed through. He placed sensors at 3 points along the southern fence, the most likely approach vector, and tested them with a bag of sand that he swung through the wire on a rope. The siren was piercing. Eli covered his ears. The sound bounced off the pole barn and came back at us like an accusation. "If they come," Clarence said, coiling the test rope, "we'll know." "If they come in those numbers," Joel said, "knowing won't be enough." "Knowing is always enough," Clarence replied. "Knowing gives you time. Time gives you choices. That's the architecture of survival. You don't need to be stronger. You need to be earlier." It was the most I'd ever heard Clarence say at once, and I realized that his economy of speech wasn't reticence. It was compression. He stored full paragraphs behind single sentences and released them only when the structure of the conversation required load-bearing weight. That night, Dana asked if she could talk to me. We sat on the back porch, away from the others, the kerosene lantern between us casting a circle of amber that made the darkness beyond it feel deliberate. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest," she said. "Okay. Do you think we can hold this place?" I thought about it. Not the polite answer, not the morale answer, the real one. I think we can hold it against what we've seen so far. I don't think we can hold it against what we saw in Ridgemont, if it comes here. She nodded. That's what I think too. "So, what are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm establishing shared reality. That's the first step in any crisis protocol. Make sure the people in the room agree on what's actually happening before you start discussing what to do about it. Is that from nursing school? That's from life. She pulled her jacket tighter. The nights were getting colder. October was leaning into November, and the mountains didn't negotiate with the calendar. I had a daughter, she said. Claire. She's 8. She's with my mother in Pennsylvania. I was supposed to drive there after my shift the night everything. She stopped, restarted. I've been assuming my mother got her somewhere safe. I've been assuming that because the alternative is something I can't hold in my head and still function. That's not weakness, I said. I know it's not. It's engineering. I'm building a structure that lets me keep going. But structures need maintenance, and every day without information is a stress fracture. I didn't know what to say. I was 19. My family was inside, all of them, within 100 feet of where I sat. The luxury of that was something I hadn't fully appreciated until Dana framed its absence. We'll find a way to get information, I said. The ham radio, maybe a longer range antenna. Clarence could probably build something. Maybe. She looked at the tree line. I just needed someone to know that there's a person out there who is the reason I haven't given up. I know now. Good. She stood. Thank you for not telling me it's going to be okay. She went inside. I sat on the porch alone for a long time, listening to the alarm system hum its low electric readiness and thinking about Claire, a girl I'd never met, sitting in the center of her mother's survival like a lantern in a dark room. 2 days later, the alarm went off at 3 a.m. I was awake instantly, not the groggy surfacing of normal sleep, but the full system activation that 3 weeks of crisis had installed in my nervous system like firmware. I was on my feet with a .22 before the siren completed its second cycle. Dad and Clarence were already at the south-facing window. Pete came down the stairs with the shotgun, moving with a speed that contradicted his age. South fence, Clarence said. Sensor 3. We killed the interior lights. Pete opened the shutter on the south window, a crack. The motion sensor light had triggered too, throwing a cone of white across the pasture, and in its beam we could see them. Not 15, not 20. I counted until I couldn't, and then I estimated, and my estimate was somewhere above 40. They were spread across the pasture in a loose wave, moving north toward us, with that synchronized wrongness that wasn't coordination, but looked, from a distance, like purpose. The siren was drawing them not faster, not with urgency, but with a directional certainty that confirmed what we'd hoped wasn't true. Sound mattered. Sound was a signal. And we'd built a signal and pointed it at ourselves. Kill the alarm, Pete said. Clarence was already moving. He pulled the wire from the car battery and the siren died. The silence that followed was worse, because now we could hear them not footsteps exactly, but the collective sound of bodies moving through grass, a dry, continuous whisper like static on an untuned radio. The lights, Mom said. Kill the motion lights. Pete hit the switch. Darkness. We stood in the dark house, 8 people breathing, and listened to 40 bodies approach our fence. Nobody spoke. That was the first rule of the next 2 hours, established not by discussion, but by instinct, the universal mammalian understanding that sound was currency, and we were bankrupt. Pete held up his hand, 5 fingers, and pointed upstairs. Go high. We moved. The staircase creaked on the 4th step. It always creaked on the 4th step. I'd learned this during my watch shifts. And it started skipping it automatically. Now I watched 7 other people navigate the same step in the dark, each one warned by the person ahead with a hand signal. And the precision of it, the choreography of fear, was something I'd remember for the rest of my life. Upstairs, we gathered in the study where Eli's cot was. 2 windows, one facing south, one facing east. Pete cracked the south window shutter, and we looked. The motion light was off, but the moon was up, 3/4 full. And it painted the pasture in a blue-white wash that turned the approaching figures into something from a painting you'd find in a museum wing you'd normally walk past. They'd reached the fence. The front line, if you could call it that, was pressing against the wire the way the single one had weeks ago. Leaning, caught, applying pressure without strategy. But 40 bodies applying pressure without strategy still generated force. I could see the T-posts bending, not breaking, bending. The wires stretching, the staples pulling, the whole structure flexing inward like a bow being drawn. "The fence won't hold," Clarence whispered. He said it with the flat authority of a man who knew what materials could bear. "How long?" Pete asked. "Minutes, maybe 20. The posts weren't set in concrete." Pete closed the shutter. In the darkness, I heard him breathing slow, controlled, the breath of a man who was forcing himself to think instead of feel. "Options," he said. "We go out the north side," Dad said. "Load the vehicles, drive." "Vehicles are in the barn. 80 yards of open ground." "We can make 80 yards. In the dark, with 8 people, including a 14-year-old, while 40 of them are on the south side and we don't know what's on the north." "We don't know there's anything on the north. We don't know there isn't." Joel spoke from the corner, where he'd been standing so quietly I'd forgotten he was there. "Send 1 person to scout the north. If it's clear, we go. If it's not, we barricade upstairs and wait for daylight." "I'll go," I said. "No," Dad said. Instant. Absolute. "I'm the fastest person here. I know where the barn is. I can check the north fence and be back in 3 minutes." I said no. "Glenn." Mom's voice. A single-name sentence, loaded now with a different cargo than I'd heard before. Not "we can't leave them," or "listen to me." Something closer to "let him." Dad was silent for 5 seconds. In the dark, 5 seconds is a landscape. "Take the .22. Stay along the house wall. If you see anything, you come back. You don't engage. You come back." "I know." "You come back." "Dad, I know." I went down the stairs, skipping the 4th step, and let myself out the north-facing kitchen door. The cold hit me first October in the mountains, the air carrying the taste of frost and pine. I pressed my back against the house wall and let my eyes adjust. The north side was open pasture running to a tree line maybe 200 yards out. Between me and the barn was flat ground, the garden, the well house. The moon was generous. I could see clearly enough to register shapes and motion. Nothing moved. I edged along the wall to the northeast corner and looked east. The barn, dark and solid, 80 yards away. The truck and the Subaru were inside. Keys on a hook by the door Pete's system. Always keys in the same place, because systems save lives when panic destroys memory. I made the run. 80 yards of open ground, the .22 in my hands, my footsteps loud on the frozen grass. I reached the barn, pressed against the siding, and scanned. North clear, east clear. The tree line was still. The only sound was my breathing, and, distantly, from the south side of the house, a sound I hadn't heard before. A metallic groan, continuous, like a ship hull under pressure. The fence giving way. I opened the barn door, found the keys, started the truck. The engine caught on the first try, and the sound of it, loud, mechanical, alive, was either salvation or a beacon. I pulled it out, then went back for the Subaru, started it, and parked both vehicles at the north side of the house with the engines running and the headlights off. I ran back inside and up the stairs. North is clear. Vehicles are running. Pete didn't hesitate. Everyone out, north door. Truck first, Subaru second. Grab nothing. Go. We went. Down the stairs, through the kitchen, out the north door, into the cold. The sound from the south was louder now. The fence was failing. A series of pops and screeches as staples pulled free and wire twisted. I didn't look. Looking would cost time, and time was down to coins. Mom and Dad got Eli into the Subaru's back seat. Dana and Clarence climbed in after him. Pete took the truck's driver's seat, Joel beside him. I ran to the Subaru's passenger side, but as I reached for the door, I heard it. The fence going. Not a single moment of collapse, but a progressive failure. A wave of metallic surrender that ran along the line like a zipper. And then the whisper of bodies in grass, no longer impeded, moving north toward the house. I got in. Dad was driving. He didn't turn on the headlights until we were 200 yards down the north access road, a dirt track that ran through Pete's back pasture to a county road beyond. The truck was ahead of us, Pete's taillights red dots in the darkness. In the mirror, the house was a dark shape against the sky. No lights in the windows, no sign of what we'd left behind. But I could feel it, the weight of abandonment, the specific gravity of a place that had been home for 3 weeks and was now being inherited by something that didn't understand inheritance. Eli was crying, not loudly, just the quiet leaking of a pressure that had exceeded his capacity. Mom had her arm around him. Dana was staring straight ahead. Clarence had his eyes closed, but his lips were moving, and I realized he was praying. I faced forward and watched the road. We drove for 4 hours. Pete led, taking back roads he knew from decades of living in the area. Routes that didn't appear on any GPS and barely registered on paper maps, logging roads, seasonal access tracks. A decommissioned fire road that climbed through dense pine forest and emerged on a ridge where you could see 30 miles in every direction, and all of it was dark. We stopped on that ridge as the sky began to lighten. Not by plan, but by necessity. The truck was low on fuel, and decisions needed to be made that couldn't be shouted through walkie-talkies between moving vehicles. Everyone got out. The cold was sharper up here, the wind constant. Pete spread the map on the truck's hood, and we gathered around it in the pre-dawn gray. 8 people who had been strangers 25 days ago and were now something else. Not family, not friends. Something the language hadn't caught up to yet, a unit defined by shared survival, bonded by proximity to the same edge. We have enough fuel to get maybe another 60 miles, Pete said. After that, we're on foot. Where are we going? Dana asked. Pete looked at the map. His finger traced north, past the ridgeline, into territory marked with contour lines so dense they looked like fingerprints. There's a fire lookout station up here, decommissioned 4 years ago when the Forest Service went to satellite monitoring. Concrete base, steel frame, 360 visibility. 1 access road, 1 staircase. Highest ground in 60 miles. You've been there? Clarence asked. Maureen and I used to hike up there. She loved the view. Something passed across Pete's face that was private, and I looked away. It's defensible? Dad asked. It's the most defensible position I know of. The access road is steep and narrow. The staircase is metal, switchback design. If we pull the lowest flight of stairs, nothing gets up. Period. What about supplies? Nothing up there. Whatever we bring is what we have. Then we bring everything we can carry, and we pray it's enough, Clarence said. The decision was made not by vote, but by the absence of alternatives. We redistributed weight between the vehicles, prioritized fuel efficiency, and continued north. The road to the lookout station was everything Pete had promised: narrow, steep, winding through forest so thick the canopy closed overhead like a tunnel. The Subaru's transmission complained on the grade. Dad downshifted and coaxed it upward. Twice, fallen branches blocked the road, and Joel and I got out to clear them. Working fast, exposed, the forest pressing in with a silence that was either empty or occupied, and we had no way to know which. We reached the station at mid-morning. It rose above the tree line on steel legs, a glass-walled cabin perched 60 feet in the air on a concrete foundation, accessed by a zigzag staircase bolted to the frame. The door at the top was padlocked, but Pete had brought a bolt cutter, a detail that confirmed the depth of his contingency thinking. The cabin was small, maybe 15 by 15, 4 windows, 1 per wall, a cot, a desk, a wood-burning stove the size of a filing cabinet, a water tank that was empty, and a pair of binoculars hanging from a nail. 8 people in 15 by 15 feet. The math was claustrophobic, but the view was something else entirely. From the lookout, you could see the mountains cascading south and west in waves of green and gray. The sky was enormous. The forest ran unbroken to the horizon in every direction except south, where far below and impossibly distant, a thread of smoke rose from what had been the direction of Ridgemont. "Burning," Pete said, looking through the binoculars. Nobody asked what was burning. The answer was everything, and we didn't need the specifics. We unloaded the vehicles and carried supplies up the staircase in relays. Canned food, water jugs, blankets, weapons, the first aid kit, the hand crank radio, the kerosene lantern, and a propane camp stove Pete had packed in the truck bed. It took 2 hours. By the time we finished, the cabin looked like a survival supply catalog had been detonated inside a phone booth. Then Pete and Clarence did the thing that made it real. They unbolted the lowest flight of stairs, 8 steps of steel grating that connected the ground to the first landing, and laid it in the grass below. Without those steps, the gap between the ground and the first landing was 12 feet of open air. Nothing without hands and intention was getting up. I stood on the second landing and looked down at the missing stairs and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. A boundary that actually meant something. Not wire, not wood, air. 12 feet of nothing, and nothing was the strongest material we'd found. Life in the lookout was compression. 8 bodies, a fraction of the space we'd had at Pete's, and the particular psychology of altitude, the world visible below us in panoramic detail, reminding us constantly of what we'd left and what was happening to it. We slept in shifts out of necessity as much as strategy. There wasn't room for everyone to lie down simultaneously. The cot was given to Eli, not because he was weakest, but because he was youngest, and the group had made an unspoken decision to protect something that looked like childhood, even as childhood was being disassembled. The rest of us arranged ourselves on the floor with blankets and folded clothing, finding positions that accommodated the close quarters with the studied diplomacy of people who understood that friction in tight spaces becomes fire quickly. The stove was our center. Clarence got it working the first day, feeding it small pieces of deadfall that Joel and I collected from the tree line, lowered up by rope in a bucket. The heat was insufficient for the space when the wind blew, but sufficient for survival. And we learned the difference between comfort and survival in precise daily measurements. Comfort is heat you don't think about. Survival is heat you calculate. Dana monitored our water situation with the focus of someone who understood that water was the first domino. The tank was empty, but Pete had identified a spring 300 yards downslope, and every morning 2 people made the trip with the jugs. It was the most exposed we got to 300 yards of open ground. The tree line close, the visibility limited by brush. Joel and I took the duty most days because we were fastest, and because speed on the return trip meant less time carrying water through territory we couldn't fully scan. On the 3rd morning at the lookout, day 28 overall, Joel and I were at the spring when we heard it. Not close, maybe a mile south, down the mountain. A sound that wasn't human and wasn't animal. A vocalization, if you could call it that, pitched in a register that made my molars ache. Like a sound you hear through a wall, coming from a room that should be empty. Joel filled the jug without pausing. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. "They're in the forest," he said. "One sound doesn't mean. It means they're in the forest." We carried the water back, I told Pete. He took the binoculars and spent 2 hours scanning the tree line from the lookout. Methodical, quadrant by quadrant. I can't see them, but the trees are thick. You wouldn't see them until they were close. How close? Close enough for it to matter. This introduced a new variable into our daily calculations. The forest wasn't empty. It might have one of them in it, or 10, or 100, and the canopy that protected us from aerial observation also protected them from ours. The spring runs became faster, more tense, and Joel started carrying the crossbow instead of the tire iron. Eli was changing, not deteriorating, transforming. The silence of the first days at Pete's had evolved into something else, a watchfulness that sat oddly on his 14-year-old frame. He took to sitting at the east window with the binoculars for hours, scanning the tree line with a patience I associated with much older men. He reported what he saw with military brevity. Movement at 2 o'clock. Deer, 3 of them. Bird activity low today. Wind shifting northwest. He was building a language for the new world, and the language was reshaping him. Mom watched this with an expression I couldn't fully read. Pride and grief layered. Her son was adapting, and adaptation meant the loss of the version that didn't need to. On day 31, the hand-crank radio picked up a broadcast. Not military, civilian. A man's voice, rough with fatigue, broadcasting on a loop from somewhere that identified itself only as Station Echo Blue Ridge. If you can hear this, there are safe zones. Repeat, there are safe zones. Federal staging area established at Fort Whitmore, bearing north-northwest from Asheville. Military escort available at rally points. Nearest rally point to our position is the Harlan Reservoir Dam. Route 9 north. Broadcasting every 6 hours. If you can hear this, you are not alone. The message repeated. We listened to it 3 times. Nobody moved to turn it off. Harlan Reservoir, Pete said slowly. That's 20 miles from my property. We passed through there on the way up. Can we trust it? Clarence asked. It's a civilian broadcast on amateur frequencies. Could be legitimate. Could be someone repeating what they heard. Could be a trap set by people who want our supplies. Could be real, Dana said. Her voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. An edge that sounded like Claire, like Pennsylvania, like a direction to walk that wasn't just away from something, but toward. We don't have the fuel to investigate and come back, Dad said. If we go, we're committing. Then we need to decide what we're committing to, Pete said. Staying here where we're safe but finite, or going there where we might find something bigger, but we might find nothing. The conversation continued for 3 hours. It was the most sustained collective deliberation we'd had since forming this group, and it revealed the fault lines. Pete wanted to stay. The lookout was defensible, the spring was reliable, the position was strong. His instinct was fortification. Dana wanted to go. Fort Whitmore was a real military installation. If there was a federal response, that's where it would be. And the route passed through territory that connected, eventually, to roads that led east, toward Pennsylvania. Joel was neutral in a way that felt decisive. He'd survive either way, and he knew it, and that knowledge relieved him of the need to advocate. Clarence sided with Donna. "We can't winter here," he said. "Not 8 people in this space with this stove. First hard freeze, and we're in trouble." Eli said nothing. He watched from the east window with his binoculars and let the adults decide. Mom and Dad were split. Mom leaned toward going the nurse, and her believed in systems, in organized response, in the idea that somewhere, someone was coordinating something larger than a family on a mountaintop. Dad leaned toward staying. The shop teacher in him believed in what he could see and touch, in concrete and steel and a 12-foot gap of air. They looked at me. "I think we go," I said. "Not because the broadcast is definitely real, because staying here is definitely finite." The vote wasn't formal, but the consensus was clear. We'd leave at dawn. The descent from the lookout was the reverse of arrival, slower, more careful, freighted with the understanding that we were surrendering elevation, surrendering the 12-foot gap, surrendering the clearest tactical advantage we'd had since the garage. Pete was the last down. He stood on the second landing for a long time, looking at the cabin. And I realized he wasn't saying goodbye to the lookout. He was saying goodbye to the version of the plan where staying still was enough. We loaded the vehicles with everything we could carry. Fuel was the constraint. The truck had maybe 30 miles, the Subaru about the same. Harlan Reservoir was 20 miles from Pete's old property, and Pete's old property was roughly 40 miles south. We couldn't make a direct route. We needed fuel. Pete knew of a Forest Service maintenance depot 5 miles down the mountain. It would have fuel storage, diesel for equipment, maybe gasoline. It was a gamble, but the alternative was running dry on the road, and a stopped vehicle in open territory was a coffin with bucket seats. The depot was a cluster of metal buildings in a clearing, a garage, a storage shed, a small office. The gate was chained, but not locked. The padlock had been cut, which meant someone had been here before us. We approached slowly, Pete and Joel on foot with a shotgun and crossbow, the rest of us waiting in the vehicles with engines running. They were inside for 7 minutes. When they came out, Pete was carrying 2 5-gallon fuel cans, and Joel had a third. "Diesel and gas both," Pete said. "Whoever was here before us left some." "Or was interrupted," Joel said. We didn't explore that thought. We fueled both vehicles and continued south, dropping off the mountain through switchbacks that revealed the valley below, in stages a quilt of fields, roads, and structures that looked undamaged from this distance. Peaceful, even, the way a painting of a landscape is peaceful because it doesn't include sound. The sound came when we reached the valley floor. Not the vocalization Joel and I had heard at the spring, but something worse. Nothing. Absolute silence. No bird song, no insects, no wind in the grass. The silence of a place that had been emptied of everything that makes noise voluntarily, leaving only the things that don't care about silence because they aren't aware of it. We took back roads. Pete navigated from memory, calling turns over the walkie-talkie with a certainty that spoke to decades of living in this terrain. We passed through what had been farmland fences standing, crops unharvested, a tractor sitting in a field with its door open. We passed a church with its marquee still displaying a message, Sunday service 10 a.m., all are welcome. We passed a school bus parked in a pull-off, every window intact, the stop sign on its arm still extended, as if the driver had been in the middle of a route when whatever happened, happened. Eli stared at the bus as we passed. I watched him in the mirror. His face did something that wasn't quite an expression. It was more like a recalculation. The face of a person adjusting an internal model to accommodate evidence that the previous model couldn't hold. At the intersection of routes 9 and 14, Pete stopped the truck. We pulled alongside. "The reservoir is 4 miles north on 9, he said through the window. "The dam is at the north end. That's where the broadcast said the rally point is." "And between here and there?" Dad asked. "I don't know. I haven't been this way since before." Before had become a complete temporal reference. Everyone knew what it meant. We turned north on Route 9. The road followed a creek that widened as we climbed, the reservoir revealing itself in pieces, a glint of water through trees, a guardrail along a steep drop, the concrete lip of the dam emerging from the landscape like a wall that nature had grown around. 2 miles from the dam, we found the first sign of organized human activity since the garage. A barricade across the road, not makeshift, not improvised. Concrete jersey barriers arranged in a chicane pattern that forced approaching vehicles to slow and weave. And behind the barriers, on a platform made from stacked pallets, a figure with a rifle. A human figure, alive, waving us forward. The rally point was not what the broadcast had promised, but it was not nothing. Behind the barricade, the dam's access road had been converted into a staging area. A dozen vehicles parked in rows. 3 large tents, a water tanker that said National Guard on the side, and maybe 40 or 50 people moving between structures with the organized purpose of an operation that had been running long enough to develop routines, but not long enough to stop looking over its shoulder. A woman in civilian clothes but wearing a military radio headset met us at the barricade. Her name was Montoya. She didn't offer a first name, and she spoke with the compressed efficiency of someone who had given the same briefing many times. "Welcome to Rally Point Echo. We're a civilian-military coordination site. We have water, limited medical, and a secure perimeter maintained by a combination of National Guard personnel and organized volunteers. We cannot promise transport to Fort Whitmore at this time. Convoy schedules are dependent on route clearance, and Route 9 North has not been cleared in 6 days. 6 days, Pete repeated. Correct. Our last convoy departed 9 days ago, and we've had no confirmation of arrival. We're maintaining the rally point and broadcasting per our instructions, but I want to be transparent. We are operating independently." "How many people here?" Mom asked. 53 with your group. Peak was 112, 2 weeks ago. Some left for the convoy. Some left on their own. She didn't mention a third category. She didn't need to. We parked the vehicles and were assigned tent space, 1 tent for families, 1 for individuals, 1 for supplies, and the medical station. Dana went to the medical tent immediately and didn't come out for 3 hours. When she did, her face was different. Older. She'd been working. "They've got a man with a compound fracture that's infected," she told me. "No antibiotics, no surgical capability. I cleaned it and packed it and told him what I could, but without medication, he's going to lose that leg or lose more." Dana. And a woman who's 7 months pregnant with no prenatal care and elevated blood pressure. and 2 children with untreated ear infections, and an elderly man with what I'm pretty sure is the early stages of congestive heart failure. This isn't a rally point. It's a waiting room. I looked at the camp, at the people milling between tents, sitting on tailgates, standing at the perimeter with hunting rifles and baseball bats and, in one case, a machete duct taped to a broom handle. They didn't look rescued. They looked collected, gathered by a broadcast into a single location that had walls and water but no clear purpose beyond persistence. Pete found the radio operator, a National Guard corporal named Singh, who was 21 and looked 40. Singh confirmed what Montoya had implied. The chain of command was broken. Fort Whitmore existed and was presumably operational, but the road between here and there passed through territory that had been overrun. The last attempt to run the road had resulted in a convoy of 3 vehicles returning with 2, and nobody talked about what happened to the 3rd. "So we're stuck," Joel said. "We're positioned," Singh corrected. "There's a difference. The difference is optimism. The difference is a concrete dam at our backs, a choke point at our front, and a defensible perimeter. We're not stuck. We're holding." Joel looked at Singh for a long moment, then nodded, not agreement, but recognition. Singh was doing what Pete had done, what Dad had done, what Clarence had done, building a frame and asking people to stand inside it. The frame was language. The material was conviction. The structure held only as long as everyone agreed to believe in it. That first night at the rally point, I sat on the dam itself, a wide concrete surface that stretched across the reservoir, the water black and still below, the sky enormous above. Dad found me there. He sat beside me without speaking. We watched the stars, which were astonishing in the absence of light pollution. The Milky Way was a river overhead, and I thought about how many of the survival stories I'd heard ended with someone looking at stars and finding peace, and how the reality was not peace, but a kind of bewildered smallness, a recognition that the universe was exactly as large as it had always been, and we were exactly as small, and the only thing that had changed was our awareness of the ratio. "You did well," Dad said. "Getting the vehicles. At Pete's place. That was brave." It was terrified. Same thing sometimes. He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother and I talked about what happens if the convoy doesn't come. And we decided that you and Eli are the priority, whatever happens. If it comes to choices, you and Eli are the choices." "Dad, I'm not asking you to agree. I'm telling you where we stand. I don't accept that." "You don't have to accept it. It's not an offer. It's a fact." I looked at him. Glenn Maddox, shop teacher, JV baseball coach, driver of a 12-year-old Subaru. The fluorescent light of Pete's garage fell across his face in my memory, and I saw him as he'd been that first morning, car keys in his hand, arm out, pushing his sons behind him. A gesture so instinctive it looked involuntary. "I love you," I said. I hadn't said it in months. College does that. Distance recalibrates the frequency of important words until you forget they have weight. "I know," he said. "Go get some sleep." I went to the tent. Eli was already asleep on a cot, his face smooth, and I watched him for a moment before lying down myself. He looked 14 again. Not the watchful version with the binoculars and the military brevity, just 14, just my brother. I closed my eyes and listened to the camp settle the murmur of voices, the distant sound of water against the dam, the creak of tent fabric in the wind. Somewhere, a radio crackled, and Singh's voice answered. Somewhere, a child coughed, and a parent murmured comfort. Somewhere, The world continued to disassemble itself. And here, on this concrete shelf above the water, 53 people held on. The convoy came on day 39. Not from the north, from the west, a direction nobody had been watching because nobody had expected anything from the west. 3 military vehicles, 2 Humvees, and a 5-ton truck grinding up Route 14 with their headlights on in broad daylight. A declaration of presence that was either confidence or desperation. The camp mobilized. Montoya was at the barricade. Singh was on the radio. Pete had the binoculars. The vehicles stopped at the chicane, and a soldier got out an officer, a captain, by the insignia, and walked toward the barricade with her hands visible and her voice calm. Captain Angela Reese, United States Army, out of Camp Ridley. We're establishing a new evacuation corridor along Route 14 West to a federal safe zone at the Shenandoah Valley Agricultural Complex. We have room for all personnel at this location. Departure in 2 hours. 2 hours. The camp erupted into motion. People packed. People argued. People cried. The man with the infected fracture was carried to the 5-ton on a stretcher by Clarence and Joel, who moved with a synchronization that spoke to the bond they'd built over 5 weeks of shared labor and shared silence. Dana found me at the vehicles. The captain says the route west connects to I-81 south. I-81 goes to Pennsylvania. I understood. You're going to find Claire. I'm going to find Claire. Dana, you can't just... I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you, the way you told me about your family, because someone should know. She put her hand on my arm. Firm, brief. The contact of someone who has precisely calibrated how much touch they can afford without losing the composure that's keeping them vertical. Thank you, she said, for listening. In the dark, on the porch. That night mattered. I know. She turned and walked toward the 5-ton, and I let her go because holding on was not something I had the right or the capacity to do. She climbed into the back of the truck and sat beside the pregnant woman and the 2 children with ear infections. And she was already assessing, already working, already being what she was built to be, even as the vehicle carried her toward a daughter who might be waiting or might not. The loading took 90 minutes. Captain Reese was efficient, organized, and visibly exhausted in the way of someone who has been efficient and organized for so long that the efficiency itself has become a form of fatigue. She checked head counts, confirmed vehicle assignments, distributed MREs, and answered questions with the practiced balance of honesty and restraint that military leadership requires. Is the safe zone real? Pete asked her directly. It's real. It's not perfect. It's overcrowded, undersupplied, and dealing with the same challenges every survivor site is dealing with. But it has walls, it has medical, and it has a command structure that's still functioning. In my professional judgment, it's the best option within 200 miles. That's not an answer. Sir, it's the only answer I have. Pete looked at the mountains, at the dam, at the lookout he couldn't see, but that he knew was up there. 60 feet in the air, glass walls, 4 windows. A place where he and Maureen had once stood and looked at a view and not needed it to mean anything except beauty. He got in the truck. We all got in. The convoy departed at 1400 hours, Route 14 West, through a valley that was green and gold in the October light, past abandoned farms and empty roads and a gas station where a hand-painted sign on the door read, "God bless and good luck." Past a bridge where someone had spray-painted "alive" in letters 4 feet tall, past everything that was broken and everything that endured, west toward a place that might be what we needed, or might be another waypoint in a journey that had no guaranteed end. Eli sat beside me in the back of the Humvee. He had the binoculars around his neck. He was watching the tree line. "What do you see?" I asked. "Trees," he said. "Just trees." But he kept watching. And I understood that the watching was the point, not what you see, but the fact that you're still looking, still scanning, still awake in a world that rewards attention and punishes its absence. He was 14, and he was doing the work of presence. And that was enough. Dad was in the front vehicle with Pete and Clarence. Mom was in the truck with Dana and the medical cases. Joel was somewhere behind us, in the last Humvee, carrying his tire iron and his silence and whatever he'd built from the wreckage of Millbrook. We were distributed across 3 vehicles, and we were still a unit. Still the thing that had no name. Still bound by a garage door opening at dawn and the choice that followed. The convoy moved west. The sun was ahead of us, sinking, turning the sky into something that a different version of me would have photographed and posted and captioned with a word like breathtaking. This version just watched it, the way Eli watched the trees, and let it mean what it meant without needing to translate it into something shareable. We drove toward the safe zone. We drove toward whatever came next. The safe zone was real. It was everything Captain Reese had said: overcrowded, undersupplied, imperfect, and standing. We arrived at dusk to floodlights and chain link and the sound of generators and children. And the combination of those sounds was so close to normal that several people in the convoy wept. I didn't. I'd passed through the territory where weeping lived and come out on the other side into something quieter, something that didn't have a name yet, but felt like the space after a held breath. Not relief, not peace, but the simple biological fact of continuation. We stayed. We worked. We slept in gymnasium overflow housing and ate meals from a communal kitchen and stood in line for water and medical and information. And every day the information got slightly more structured, slightly more coherent, as if the world was slowly remembering how to organize itself. Dana left after 2 weeks, south toward Pennsylvania, with a military escort that was going that direction. She hugged me before she left, and she said, "I'll find her." And I believed her because belief was the currency she'd been spending since the night in the garage, and she wasn't bankrupt yet. Joel stayed. He didn't talk about staying. He just didn't leave. He worked perimeter security with the same quiet focus he'd brought to everything. And one evening, I saw him without the tire iron for the first time, his hands empty, and I understood that he'd set it down. Not lost it, set it down. Clarence built things. He couldn't stop. Shelving, reinforced doors, a rain catchment system that doubled the camp's water collection. His hands were always moving, and the motion was the same thing. It had always been insistence that the future was real, expressed in nails and lumber. My father stood at the perimeter fence every morning at dawn and looked east toward the mountains, toward Pete's house and the lookout and the road we'd driven. He never said what he was looking for. I never asked. I stood beside him. That was enough.